In this program, Joseph discusses the distinction between knowledge and wisdom, the practical aspects of meditation, the spiritual aspects of relationship, and the teaching function of myth. He also has some very illuminating comments on the breakdown of human decency at the very time we are being called upon to recognize that we are a single world community. He points again to the essential unity of all humankind and offers the hope that by rediscovering our mythic traditions and the lessons they provide, we may yet be able to act out of our common humanity. This conversation took place in the spring of 1984 when Joseph was 80 years of age. We began with a question about relationship and meditation. One of the things I think you said or wrote about, I can't recall which, but it was in an article, I think, an interview with you, where you talked about the importance of relationship, and you talked about it in relative to meditation, and how the meditation quest could be the death of relationship. What did you mean with that?
Oh, I was noticing, and this was way back, that when my friends would start to go to some meditation interviews with gurus or whatnot, 3 or 4 years later, I'd be hearing about their divorce. And this finding of the divine in yourself, without seeing it in other people as well, is what I think has come out of a good deal of this inward life meditation thing. Why isn't our relationship right here the basis for a meditation of our, common humanity? That's what we're talking about, isn't it? And that's what we're always talking about. And so I think for the Western person, where our social traditions don't insist on the relationship system as they do in the East, going then into inward meditation is a distraction from the world. Furthermore, the inward meditation in India, at any rate, belongs to the second half of life, not the first. And here are people who haven't even experienced life yet learning how to get out of it. It's not quite harmonious to our needs.
I recall that student that came up to you in one of your talks and said, Professor Campbell, what we're doing today is we're going from infancy to wisdom. And you said...
That was a shock to me, really. I have been talking about Dante and the stages of life, moving from adolescence and so forth through the period of maturity, then to wisdom. And this youngster comes up at the end of the lecture and says, Dr. Campbell, you don't realize today we go directly from what you call infancy to wisdom. Well, I said, darling, that's really wonderful. All you've missed is life, Well, that surprised me at that time, but I had 3 more youngsters during the course of that wonderful period, the 60s, come up with that one.
Joseph, that last anecdote about missing life certainly brings to mind the importance and the relevance of myth and exploring the depth and breadth of mythology to bringing us more in touch with how important it is to live life as fully and completely as possible, because certainly all the mythic lore that we can come across at its essence is that understanding, appreciation, and deep experience of life and all its richness.
Well, there's a good point here, Michael. This young lady thought, as a result of sitting at a desk in school year after year after year, that wisdom consists in knowledge, knowledge obtained from books and from concepts. But it's the integration of this with life that really constitutes wisdom. And myths do not come from a concept system. They come from a life system. They come out of a deeper center. We must not confuse mythology with ideology, Myths come from where the heart is and where the experience is. And the mind may even wonder why people believe these things. The myth is not pointing to a fact. The myth is pointing beyond facts to something that informs the fact. It's, as I've been saying to people who've been interviewing me lately, I've been on a trip for this book doing the publicity, and it has involved a lot of interviews with people who ask, what is a myth? It's amazing. And finally, I found out what's the problem. A myth is a metaphor that points beyond the image to a mystery, and I'll tell you what the mystery is in a minute. When the metaphor is mistaken for the message, for instance, there was one interviewer who finally I realized he didn't know what a metaphor is, so he didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, well, give me an example of a metaphor. He was totally broken up. And finally, after fussing around, he comes out with, well, I'll try. He said, so-and-so runs very fast, and people say he runs like a deer. That's a metaphor. I said, no, that's not a metaphor. The metaphor is so-and-so is a deer. Well, he said, that's a lie, just as myth is. I said, no, it's a metaphor. Well, then when you think God is our Father, you think he is? That's a metaphor. And the metaphor points to two ends. One is psychological. That's why dream is metaphoric. It's metaphoric of the structures in the psyche. And your dream will have to do with the level of psychological realization that you are operating on, or that's pushing. And these levels can be deepened. The ultimate depth, however, is the metaphysical, pointing past all conceptualizations, all things and so forth. And so you have a double metaphor here. One is psychological, and the other is metaphysical. And when the two have brought together, where psyche and metaphysics come together, there you have a real myth. And then the whole of your life in the world, the sociological and the cosmological aspects, have to be revisioned in terms of these realizations. That's the function of the artist today. So there are two stages to this thing. One is going inward, finding the relationship of your own deepest ground to the ground of being so that you become, as it were, transparent to transcendence. And the other is then that of bringing this realization back into operation in the field. And that's the work of the artist, to interpret the contemporary world as experienced and as known in terms of this relevance to our inward life.
Let me attempt to try a simple translation here. What we're talking about is the myth that we know about, the traditions and the kinds of lore that we'll find in your books are the collective myths. These are the myths that have been collected over humanity's history. And what's important is for each of us to probe our own individual myth in relationship to that collective myth. Is that what you're saying?
Two aspects. One, to probe your own individual myth, and the other, to bring it into relation. You know, that's the function of meditation, and that's the function of poetic and aesthetic insight.
So there's a very practical aspect to myth.
Well, you bet your life.
It's not just meant for the shelves of academia.
On the contrary, I mean, that's where it loses. And when it's reduced to that, all you have then is academic thinking, which I find that the real academic, the specialist academic, doesn't know what it's all about. They don't. The only reviews I've had of my book from professional anthropologists have been ridiculous. And the real reviews have come from humanists, from people who know what I'm trying to do.
Well, when we look at our entire educational structure, one notices that it's almost devoid of life experience. It's basically knowledge out of books.
That's correct.
That seems to be a big problem.
Well, that's something every student really realizes at a certain point. You know, what in heaven's name am I going to do with this stuff? I can remember the day that occurred to me. I was in Paris, graduate school, studying Romance philology and medieval literature, and I was sitting in the garden of Cluny there, where Bouvard-Mich and Saint-Germain come together, and I thought, what in heaven's name am I doing? I don't even know how to eat a decent, nourishing meal, and here I'm learning what happened to Vulgar Latin when it passed into Portuguese and Spanish and French. I quit. That was where I really gave up the work on the PhD and took myth in another way.
It seems that that's a crossroads that many people are kind of coming to these days, and many people find themselves at a transitional state in their lives when they're really looking at society's rules and traditions and laws, as it were, as the way you're supposed to act, and they're finding internally that there's something else they need to do.
Something missing.
But yet society has no, it's like there's no approval system there for that act. And so one does have to jump over the edge into the unknown and pursue one's own quest, and very much individually and alone.
Well, you might say, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that you're free. The bad news is that you don't know what to do with it. We have been released from the crucifixion, you might say, of a society that is controlling our thought. We're free. But we've also lost the ones that tell us what the wisdom of the world was. And that's the advantage, I say, of a liberal arts education. You're at least put in touch with the thinking that has moved societies and mankind. However, when you go into a specialization in a certain field, even in an academic field, learning about, the archaeological stratum in New Mexico on this level, and that's it, you're the specialist in that. Or as I knew one chap who had done his PhD thesis on the punctuation of Shelley's sonnets. I don't know what in heaven's name good this is. But you see, it was way along when it dawned on me that this had nothing to do with my life. There I had gone through 2 years of graduate work at Columbia. I was in 2 years in Europe. And how many students go along that far, It's only then that I realized the inadequacy of this material that I was full of for life. I just dropped the PhD right at that point.
Going a little further with that point of living in life and life experience being so important, and kind of returning to something we were talking about earlier, and that is relationship, and the relationship of male and female particularly. And not only from a mythic point of view, which you're eminently qualified to talk from, but also from an experiential point of view, because you've had a successful relationship for 40-plus years
46
now.
Years.
With Gene Erdman, dancer extraordinaire. What's happening in these times when we see the emergence of the feminist movement, the assertion of woman power, the kind of return of the goddess, as it were, the patriarchal society we've lived in to some extent, and all of that wrapped up in relationship? What's happening to relationship around all of those kinds of changes that have been occurring over the past couple of decades?
Well, this is a big story,
yes, I know,
Michael. And what I'm going to say, it may hurt me, but I think the women full of resentment, and I get too much of that feeling from this whole thing, they're not going back to the mother goddess at all, who is not resentment. She is a mother, and she knows how to relate. And the great power of the mother and a woman is relationships. She understands these things, not in terms of who's the winner here, but in terms of human values. And it's the male who represents, achievement and who's top boy in this club. And these women who now begin to want achievement have gone over into the patriarchal thing. They haven't gone back to the mother. Do you understand what I'm saying? They've accepted, so to say, the male ethos and have aligned themselves with it to the damage of their own female character.
What would be an example of this? Would this be an example of the woman becoming a telephone worker on the pole?
No, it has nothing to do with the work they're doing. It has to do with the inner attitude toward it. Now, I was in a wonderful seminar thing, and one woman spoke up, and she said that the way her mother had submitted to her father and had, as it were, given herself to him, taught her that this was not what she was going to do. I mean, the whole thing of marriage is of relationship and yielding and knowing what the functions. Each is playing a role in an organism here. One of the things that I have realized, and that I think people when they're long married do realize, is that marriage is not a love affair. You know, a love affair has to do with personal satisfaction and all of this immediate satisfaction. But as I've said time and time again, marriage is an ordeal, and it's yielding. It's yielding, and that's why it's a sacrament, because you're giving up your personal, what can we call it, simplicity, to participate in a relationship. And when you're giving to someone, you're not giving to that person. You're giving to the relationship. And if you realize that you are in the relationship as well as the other person, this thing then becomes what it truly can be. Namely, a life-building, a life-fostering and enriching experience, not an impoverishment because you're giving to somebody else. Do you see what I mean?
Sure. It's a secret of giving generally.
Well, indeed. So I think this is a main problem. I know so many people marry just out of a love affair experience without realizing they're moving into a new dimension of life. And I think one can even say that that dimension has nothing to do with what may happen if you have then following that the crisis of a passing love affair here and there. You know, those do not conflict when they're properly understood. So these are complicated things.
These are complicated things indeed. Joseph, another thing myth does is it informs us about what stage of life we're in. What about that?
Well, that's one of the main functions of myth has been what I call the pedagogical, to carry a person through the inevitable stages of a lifetime. And the stages of a lifetime are the same today as they were in the Paleolithic caves. You're a youngster, dependent on parents and other authorities to teach you what life is and what your relationship to other people has to be and where you are. And then you have to give up that attitude of dependence and receiving instruction, and not only instruction but punishment and so forth, and become a self-responsible authority for what you do. In the old societies, your authority had to be in terms of the given order of that society. In our society, we are more creative. That is to say, we see new possibilities. The individual, however, has to evaluate and accept his evaluations and live in those terms. And then comes the stage of realizing I'm yielding. The world is in other hands. I'm moving on to another stage. And the myth tells you what the values are in terms of the possibilities of your particular society. But you see, we don't have a mythology for our particular social order today. The myths belong to earlier times. And God, how things have changed, just in my own lifetime. So we don't have the instruction. We're in a kind of free fall. All that one can be taught is how to be a decent human being. And then in the new situations, you have to work it out yourself, how to handle these things. But if you don't know what it is to be a human being, or what it used to be even to be a human being, then it's a free fall without knowing what strings to pull.
Joseph, you mentioned the reality that we have become one world community, but we're still failing to recognize it. And it just brings up the idea of the need for new myths, and certainly one of the new myths is the idea of community and the extension of family, and perhaps even the return to an old one, the tribal life, as it were, because in many respects we see communities emerging around the planet that do have kind of almost like a tribal life style to them. What about that?
Well, the problem is to realize you're a member of a small organism functioning as part of a large organism. And the problem of commitment of the smaller to the larger is the main one here, as I see it. The nation is something I think that is going to have to dissolve, but not the family unit. The family unit is an organic base. A lot of the crime, a lot of the troubles right now comes from the dissolution of the family. Everything's been thrown on the schools. We receive children who haven't learned how to behave decently as human beings, and it's supposed to be up to the school to inculcate ethics. That lies behind this whole prayer in the school problem. The prayer should be at home, not in the schools, because there are so many different prayer systems. And the fact that the children have to sit there and hear prayers recited to a deity who's not the name of the deity that is of their family, this I think is throwing the whole thing out of order. The family has to assume the responsibility, and I don't know how it can be brought about.
So in some sense, what we're talking about is that in ages past, when a man's word was his bond, and agreements were made verbally and not with extensive contracts, etc. It seems we've lost our understanding of integrity and ethics and values, and in many respects that somehow our institutions have been inculcated with the institution is more powerful and more meaningful than human beings. And something has been lost in the process, and certainly the mythic past has much to teach us in that respect, doesn't it?
Yes, but just primary human decency, I mean, something happened after the Second World War. It really did. And out of my own experience, which is simply that of the academic world, we couldn't keep books in the library. In a small college, the students are plundering the library, taking the books out. So now they've had to establish traps, so that the book has some piece of metal in it or something. They walk through something, there's a buzz, here's a kid stealing a book. That never happened before. And this indicates a basic loss of a sense of the individual as a member of a community. It's what have you done for me lately, you know?
Sad to say, this basic loss of the sense of the individual as the member of a community, as Joseph put it, persists today in the continuing problems of racial prejudice and other social ills. Ironically, Joseph Campbell, who spoke so eloquently to the need for finding a common ground among people of different cultures, has himself become the focus of a controversy revolving around charges of prejudice. In the fall of 1989, architecture critic and New Yorker columnist Brendan Gill wrote an essay in the New York Review of Books accusing Joseph Campbell of having made anti-Semitic remarks during the course of Gill's long acquaintance with Campbell. Though I cannot speak to what happened with Mr. Gill, personally I can address the 13 years that I knew Professor Campbell, and at no time did I experience his being anti-Semitic. Nowhere in his voluminous record of published work, which includes extensive audio and video recordings, can one find any indication that he harbored such prejudice. Still, the controversy persists, like the problem of prejudice itself. What is perhaps most compelling about this situation, an illuminating paradox, if you will, is that, as you're about to hear, Campbell often urged his audience to recognize that we are not separate, that whatever our background, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, or whatever, we are, finally, one with each other. In the following passage from a talk he gave at a New Dimensions event in 1983, Joseph takes up Schopenhauer's question about what happens in a human being to produce acts of great personal heroism. His answer serves as a standard of tolerance and empathy that we can all aspire to.
Schopenhauer asks, what is it that breaks through when that happens? And his answer is, this is a metaphysical realization. This is the sudden realization that you and that other are one. We are all of the one life, the one consciousness, and not only we, human beings, but we're one with the rabbits and the trees and all of that. And the experience of separateness in space is simply a function of the way our consciousness works. But we have another level of consciousness that knows this other thing. You and the other are one. Most of us, living most of the time, forget the values of that other side. The problem is to bring the two in balance. And you know, one recognizes this, that one and the other are one. And it's the principle of love, which is the principle of, in the Kundalini, the heart chakra, where you hear the sound of Om, that sound of the radiance of God that shines and resounds in all things. When that is experienced, then the self-protection thing falls away. Now, it's easy to stand up and talk spiritually and religiously about we're all one and forget that there's another set of requirements, namely that we're many as well. And then it's easy to talk about being many and how we have to defend this, that, and the other, and forget that we're all one. The problem of transformation of consciousness consists in giving in each situation the values that are proper to the 2 points of view. This is not easy.
Indeed, it is not easy. But we may hope that with perseverance and compassion and commitment, we will yet unlearn prejudice and come to experience ourselves as a worldwide human community in the spirit of Joseph Campbell's vision.